Hi everyone, welcome again to the Bible Project podcast. I'd like to remind you that the transcript of each and every one of these podcasts appear in the notes section of the relevant podcast itself on the podcast website. Today we've reached Genesis part 9, which is going to consider Genesis chapter 1 verses 3 to 5. Many people today believe the universe is millions of years old. However, the Bible talks about God creating the universe in what it refers to as 6 days. So that begs the question, what sort of day are we talking about here? What is the definition of a day according to Genesis chapter 1? People who study these things roughly fall into 3 groups. The first of these, they would say that the Genesis days are 24-hour days, just like today. The second view is sometimes referred to as the day-age theory, and this position holds that these days are long periods, eons of time if you like, meaning that these days represent 6 successive ages. The third interpretation is one you may not heard of before, but it's popular among certain sections of the evangelical church, and it's called revelatory days. The idea of a revelatory day is that God did not create in 6 literal days, rather he revealed his creation over 6 literal days. However, what I'd like to do is approach this passage just like I would any other passage of Scripture. And what I mean by that is I'd like to go through these verses and apply the same rules of interpretation just like I would if I was looking at any other passage in the Bible. I think later on it might be reasonable to compare the conclusion of such an approach and see how these views compare to each other. Let me begin by reminding you that we were told last time in the opening 2 verses of Genesis that God created the heavens and the earth, and when he did, the earth was described as being without form and void. And now we find as we progress through the rest of this chapter, we are told about how God formed the earth and how he will populate it with created creatures. The first 3 days will tell us about God creating the light, the sky, the land and the plants, and in the second block of 3 days run as a parallel to the first 3 days when he is seen to populate the earth. Have you ever noticed the fact that on the first day it is declared that God created light? But also notice that it will not be until the 4th day that he will create the sun and the moon. On the 2nd day he creates what we would call the sky, and then on the 5th and 6th day, etc., he creates fish, birds, and eventually humanity. It is not until the 6th day he creates humanity and animals to roam around this world that he has created. But this time the message I would want to look at is just this first day. Over the following podcast we'll look together at each of these days of creation. And then we'll finish this opening section by making a spiritual application of how this all might meaningfully apply to us who are living out our Christian faiths in the 21st century. So this passage of Scripture begins in verse 3 that telling us God created the heaven and the earth. So let's start with the first day. And it says this, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." So let's be clear about something here. When it's talking about light, it's talking about the element of light, not what we simply think of as daylight today emitted by a heavenly body like the sun. When he creates light on the first day, it is the elemental principle of light, something that is separate from darkness that is being created here. And it says that God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. So evidently, previously to this, there was nothing. There was, in fact, an absence of even light. And we see God speak. God commands, in a sense, by the use of the term, "let there be light." and we are told, behold, there was light. And when the text tells us that God said he saw the light and said that it was good, what the term good means, it means that the light was useful for something. It was declared good because the light had a meaning, it had a purpose. So that was the first day. So what about the second day? Well, we'll have a look at that next time. Okay, everyone. That's it for this time. Now, the place to go for all the links to this ministry and other ministries and podcasts that I do is the podcast notes section of this podcast on the Buzzsprout website. There you'll find links to the Facebook page, my YouTube channel, the sister podcast, the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, and also links even to my SoundCloud page where I create the background music and sound design for this podcast. And there's also, even if you're that way inclined, a place where you can support the podcast and the other ministries to the tune of £1 a month, which really helps with the funding and costs of doing this. But other than that, I really trust you've been blessed by our time together, and I hope to see you all here again very soon.